Hello everybody and welcome back to another Future of the Fortress. This is the monthly Q&A that Tarn Adams does on the Bay 12 forums, answering questions about Dwarf Fortress development and discussing the future of the game with the community. These posts tend to skirt a line between questions and answers, as well as development discussion and brainstorming. If you'd like to take part in these forum posts yourself, there's a link to that in the video description. And I will note that some of these questions actually reference the interview that I did with Tarn last month. In case you haven't seen that yet, I'll also link that in the description of this video. I will warn you it's quite long. These forum posts are usually released on the first of the month, and it generally takes me about a week to get to them. And because I've taken so long, Tarn actually posted a small update on the next upcoming patch on bay12games.com, so we'll start off with that. Toady writes, cheerfully continuing along with the next routine patch, hopefully next week. So far it's the normal collection of bug fixes and an added goodie of being able to use your last material for simple buildings and constructions. The Lua test is going well and has received a few updates so far. No ETA yet as to when that'll be merged with the main branch, but it's going smoothly enough. GDC is coming up in 10 days, and that will likely push the patch following 5107 into April. We'll probably also start on the first siege coding then as well. Now I'm suddenly very much looking forward to this routine patch after that first note about being able to reuse the last material. Looking forward to that one. Now we dive into the monthly report from Tarn, and he writes, we've got the Lua stuff up on the experimental branch, and we've done a few routine patches in February. Now we're done with the adventure mode update. In March, there's GDC interrupting things a bit, but we should manage another patch before that starts up. We'll keep cleaning things up a bit before the beginning work on sieges. 5,500 copies sold in February. It was a short month without any official sales, and the regular patches don't move numbers upward at all in the short term, but they keep people cheerful, and we'll see what March has in store. And the first question of the month comes in from the Flame 52, and they say, I've been reading Conan the Barbarian lately. It occurred to me that most of them can be reenacted in adventure mode, but with one key missing thing. Conan is always rescuing and seducing fair maidens in distress. Right now, there is none of that whatsoever in adventure mode. The adventurers we create are asexual, so they can't even participate in romance in fort mode. Make romance is a need that can't be fulfilled. When can we expect adventurers to be able to romance? And Tarn quotes Eric Blank's response, so I'll read that first. And they say, romance was waiting on a rework of gender and sexuality and relationships in general, and being able to choose them for your adventurers. And all the UI elements that would come along with a dating simulation, I bet. But I reckon that the Boyfriend Dungeon team have some tips for that. I imagine if the player can't just force their character to love whoever they tell them to, i.e. your character's personality and desires can be overridden by your whims, there's a possibility of not being able to find a partner for them because they just hate everybody. Because you min-max their personality to avoid all needs. Admittedly, I sometimes do that exact thing. But if the player can force them to love whoever the player wants them to, then you're just ignoring the character's simulated personality. And Tarn's response is, yeah, it's up to the longer-term development goals. There are various issues and preliminaries as Eric Blank has covered, but it's something we want to do. The question of following the character's personality is something that comes up generally in adventure mode. And we use needs right now to simulate part of that, encouraging actions to follow the personality. That doesn't have an effect unless the character is activated in fort mode for another part, bad things happening. But we don't have enough stressors for some actions, and stress doesn't matter much in adventure mode. Question from NMJ, and they say, in the Mythic Artifacts and Expanded Artifacts Framework section of your development document, you mention automatons and magical prostheses. How do you envision magical automatons functioning? Would they resemble the classic D&D golems, or would you give them your own unique spin? Would they be created by fort magicians, and if so, what duties would they perform? Hauling, cleaning, patrolling, etc.? And Tarn's response is, so, as people have experienced, the new dev page was just about near-term future developments, and these broader questions weren't elaborated on. But they all still hold. I'm not so much about giving things unique spins as having the game come up with the spins, but we always have to start somewhere, and it's hard to know whether that'll mean one spin or a few. Who makes them, what they are, and what they do, all of that is up for grabs. We'd thought about divine servants, constructed runic elemental critters, and more mechanical stuff, and I think the mechanical ones are trickier in a sense, since we try to do things in a vaguely properly physical way, when they aren't magical, even if our mechanisms are very vague. So, for instance, this steampunk style stuff is where I'm not sure where we are going. It's more scientific than magical in that genre, mostly, with the understanding that the science is silly, but not taken as silly. And then Tarn quotes Rhino's response here, so I've added it kind of in the middle, and then I'll continue with Tarn. And they say, the fact that automatons are actually mentioned on there is a crazy and awesome thing that I feel like rarely gets acknowledged or brought up. It's perhaps improper to ask a question about that old dev page, considering how soon we are apparently getting a new version of it. But I think this is a great question, and I hope that weird fantasy robot things survive the next draft. It also brings to mind Tarn's recent statement of, if we don't get a chance to do a space game, Dwarf Fortress should be the space game. Because again, his willingness to not let the game be bound by genre is very inspiring. I would love for him to elaborate on this in general, so we will see how much this topic gets illuminated on the dev page. And if not, then may I submit questions pertaining to how far exactly he's willing to allow the realm of magic to act as a vehicle for science fantasy themed systems and content. And Tarn's continuation is, overall, doing silly science is perfectly valid for the game, but I don't know how we'll approach that. This goes into Rhino's space mention as well. There's the Spelljammer style and the planner stuff, which is more magically inflected, but there's all the rest of the sci-fi for spacey stuff, and where that fits into Dwarf Fortress is harder since there's a lot of tech separating them. A question from Fat Ace, and they say, after some time of testing, I have come to notice that the 7 symbols and the throne require to be made out of items that are either generated or special, and the value of said item seems to not matter. Out of curiosity, could this be tweaked for the items and symbols to take in consideration the value of an item as well as the generated special metals? Seems odd, but funny that a king would want an adamantine or divine metals would turn a blind eye to an item that holds more value than a divine artifact. I would assume that artifacts with a value of over 20,000 in-game would suffice as a symbol, or possible raw-wise, a material that holds a value over 100 mat value would suffice possibly too. The more I looked into this, it is entirely possible to still avoid digging through those pillars to fulfill the king, by raiding vaults. And Toadie's response is, yeah, the idea is to get people to dig downward rather than just using the value. Vault raiding should be far more dangerous than it currently is. Question comes in from Amand, and they say, on the topic of siege improvements, is there any chance that war animals will get an improvement and rework as well? Currently, they tend to wander off randomly at the wrong moments, so I find they're mostly useful as extra muscle to be sent along with raiding and pillaging parties on off-site missions. Or I throw a bunch of them into cages and release them when invaders pass by. It would be good if they could follow squads' orders, or at least not leave their master's sides when the squad is being given orders during a siege. Would introducing multiple vectors of attack be possible? Or perhaps the army split up into multiple groups after spawning? I noticed that sieges tend to always appear around the same general location, which I believe you are trying to address by getting them to use alternative routes, and having armies march in and form multiple directions, and perhaps even staggered as a method of employing diversions. Or potentially force the player to spread their forces thin or leave their flanks open. And Tarn's response is, I'll give them a look. It's sad to not involve our animal friends, and we've come up with a few naughty things. Hopefully, they will be troublesome. A question from Dino, and they say, building sites in adventure mode was mentioned. Will that just be about implementing the existing feature from the free version, or can we expect new features and additions? Also, are there any plans to expand on site management for both existing and self-built sites? Taking over a site is already possible in both modes. With army stuff coming in the not-so-far future, controlling one or more sites to get resources and manpower seems interesting. And Tarn's response is, we're going to do something in addition broadly. Site management has to start somewhere. Our original plan for site management in the beginning was the old army arc stuff, which is kinda sorta up for grabs here, but not yet turned into bullet points the way sieges have been. When we get closer to sites and underground maps, we'll convert them into bullet points in the same way. The number one emphasis will be on getting old stuff working, and then we'll do some new things from among crafting and cross-mode stuffs, etc. A question from Dino, and they say, will building owning stuff be possible within existing sites? Like buying a building in a village, or building one yourself on a plot of land you bought inside said village, or expanding and upgrading a house you bought and stuff like that. And Tarn's response is, it's on the dev pages, so it's on that timeline. Once you can do that, anything we've done up to that point for your own sites and buildings should apply to some extent, limited by whatever the site is and how it operates. Another question from Dino, and they say, will the improved sieges only apply to defending your fort, or will we be able to besiege others once the army stuff is done? I'm imagining something like the Total War games, but that probably isn't what Dwarf Fortress is aiming for. And Tarn's response is, the near-term top of the dev page's sieges stuff concerns being attacked. The larger army stuff included improving army and use off-site, but we're not there yet. A couple multi-parters and short ones from DPH Kraken, and they say, what led you to call that class of night creatures, lime green ends, is still accurate as night trolls? They're quite unlike the predefined troll creature, and their cryptic mannerisms read more along the lines of witch behaviors to me. And Tarn's response is, yeah, this was an old series of books Zach and I had growing up. They were called Trolls there. This is also where night creatures got their name. Another one from DPH Kraken, and they say, how far do you plan to take the strategy game aspects of missions and diplomacy? And will we be able to transition our games from Sims or Rogue, Dealer's Choice, to Crusader Kings? And Tarn's response is, there's a bit of perspective difference, so I'm not sure we can show all of the information Crusader Kings shows, if we get to that point. But we'd like to have a lot more options in how you interact with the outside world. And we'd like the outside world to be more interesting. A question from Dagonob, and they say, are there any plans to tweak combat weirdness as far as armor goes? Like facial features not being protected by helmets, caps being random 50-50 to block, instead of being based on a skill, and large creatures like elephant men having much stronger armor due to their size. While the system is impressive, your use of momentum especially, seems like there's a lot of nuance that can be put into armored combat. Are these systems something that may be changeable, soon by modding? Oh, and a quick one. Will we be able to refill siegers' tunnels with dirt after a siege? And Tarn's response is, we're going to look at the combat generally, but it's not clear how much we'll get to when we're doing things like Reach. Some of that will involve new moddable entries, but getting all of the combat logic out into scripts is not in the near-term plans. Various people have expressed interest in being able to refill with dirt in order to maintain farming zones. We'll likely provide something there, which does raise questions about how clay and sand zones, etc., etc. A question from Rikus, and they say, I'm a bit worried about the upcoming demolish and dig features for enemies. One of the main reasons I haven't played RimWorld since 2020 is the unsafe feeling that enemies can fall from the roof, dig through the floor, and bash through the walls anytime, with no way to completely stop it. It is interesting for a few times, but soon becomes annoying. Unlike RimWorld, Dwarf Fortress has a much bigger potential in mega project building and social tavern and library forts, as well as much richer storytelling aspects. So it doesn't need to fill the time with meat grinding events all the time. So my question is, will we be able to prevent demolishing and digging without turning off the whole feature? I'm mainly thinking about covering the fortress in steel walls and floors, or something similar. It shouldn't be as easy to dig through steel compared to soil or soft stone. Also, if the map has a heavy aquifer, will enemies suicidal dig through it? Or will there be something to let them do it without drowning? And Tarn's response is, yeah, we've been looking up the history of rebar and reinforced walls, and are plotting some options for people that want to turtle up a bit more. We don't want things to be unfair or arbitrary. Ultimately, they're still going to kill you. So if you're in a place and are a target, that kind of thing will come up. But we're also hoping to strengthen the variety of starting scenarios as we get through the dev stuff. So that would be another tool, as it is already in a Mark Stark way, embarking where you are inaccessible. I think teaching them to aquifer break properly would be pretty advanced. They'll likely notice naturally damp stone instead, and artificially damp stone might be another matter, and then we have to think if it's too easily cheesable and proceed from there. A question from Inarius, and they say, you have talked about enemies avoiding death traps when they know that they are there, is one. Can you give us more details? I'm quite interested, and it has a lot of implications, I suppose, in the change of enemy behavior and AI of hostiles in general. And Tarn's response is, I won't have real details until it's done, since I'm going to have to try some things. But, in general, there will be a lot of tracking of data for the siegers for use by their AI. And if they can find other paths or other methods of probing prisoners, animals, traps, etc., we're going to have to try to provide some. Now this one looks like a multi-parter, but Tarn doesn't answer it as a multi-parter, so I'm just going to read it as it comes up. Sam Butcher writes, I recall you talking in the past about multi-tile enemies. While that was in the context of boats, I assume that such tech would be applicable to living creatures as well. My first thought on this is that the mega beasts that are drawn in the Steam version are as way bigger than the tile they are located in would be perfect candidates to become dimensionally larger. I have several questions about this. Regarding navigation, how would a 2x2 creature act if it wanted to chase a dwarf and adventure through a one tile wide corridor? Would this just not be able to do that? A common trope in media. Would different tiles contain different parts of the creature? I think that would mean that its facing direction mattered. And how would multi-tile creature be displayed in ASCII graphics? Just as a bunch of associated symbols? I was also going to ask how non-rectangular creatures like giant snakes that would actually snake through the fortress, or on a giant octopus with its physical tentacles. But that sounds like a completely different can of worms and unimaginable implementation nightmares. And Tarn's response is, boats and multi-tile creatures wouldn't use the same tech, since boats are more like maps that have map-like things, buildings, stockpile, etc. Multi-tile creatures I've thought less about, but I think they'd occupy maps rather than being maps, like the current single-tile creatures. So they'll also create a lot of problems. I don't have answers to your questions because they depend on the basic implementation, which isn't a settled matter. I wrote a multi-tile dragon prototype in Classic some years back and had different symbols for different parts, and they occupy different tiles, but this opens up a lot of problems with movement and pathing that didn't seem like they were time efficient to get into. A question from the Plump Helmet Man, and they say, do you have plans in the near pre-map rewrite future to organically incorporate dungeon denizens and magic materials and items into World Gen history? I get that their short-term implementation was intended as more of a proof of concept than anything else, but to me at least, they can currently feel distractingly disjointed from the lore of the world they exist in. Any small steps towards making them more active participants in the world history would be welcome, in my opinion. And Tarn's response is, they are intentionally unincorporated so as to not break the tutorial in Chosen. It's an annoying problem with them, and generally, we'll have to overcome it somehow. But yeah, I'm aware and was aware before implementing them that they'd feel a little hollow. Hopefully it can come together in some cheerful way in the future, but I'll always be a bit worried about the tutorial aspect. A question from Haifeng, and they say, I hope it isn't too rude to bring up another game like this, but I ask as a lover of both. Have you seen the game Keeper RL? While it was designed in the image of Dungeon Keeper, I think it takes a lot of notes from Dwarf Fortress. In a previous Q&As, there were discussions of transitioning between Fortress mode and Adventure mode. You mentioned issues with time passing, and Keeper RL happens to have similar gameplay, where you have real-time dungeon mode going on and a creature mode, where you are manually controlling a single creature, and time instead passes in turns just like Dwarf Fortress Adventure mode. The game allows the player to switch between the two modes and changes the passage of time accordingly, from real-time to turn-based. Might a design like that work for Dwarf Fortress? And Tarn's response is, yeah, there's a difference between the length of time, and that makes all the fort mode and AI jobs, etc., just not work in adventure mode, and vice versa. So switching back and forth at will isn't easy to do. Doing a one-time switch is probably what we'll get first. And a question from Urist Mix Hates Elves, and they say, is it just me, or do subterranean creatures immediately attempt to exit the map via the surface's boundaries whenever they have the chance? If so, is this an intentional feature? And Tarn's response is, the underground is in a weird state right now, since we have the armies moving about above ground, but they don't really work underground. There will likely be some changes and improvements here when we get to the underground map additions, either when fort mode attacks are updated or adventure mode underground travel. A question from Kanakapa? I'm sorry. Since we're getting closer and closer to the myth and magic, and changes associated with it, such as the map rewrite, what are your plans when it comes to ghosts in Fortress mode? The current ghost mechanic seems too gamey and predictable. It would be really fun to see ghosts integrate into the narratives in the Fortress, instead of being just a motivator to bury your dwarves. I think that a narrative where a dead squad commander comes back to finish his last battle would be a really nice example of storytelling in Dwarf Fortress. And Tarn's response is, we don't have any current near-term plans. Ghosts are a bit more fleshed out than various other things, but I agree, it could be more interesting. A question from Volleylol, and they say, this will maybe be answered by the way of release before the month is over, but will the Lua beta contain changes and upgrades to modding, such as adding cut select to all object types? I will also note that the Lua beta is out on the experimental branch right now. And Tarn's response is, I'm not sure of the current state. I know Putnam is interested in making the commands consistent and more powerful, if it's not currently the case. A question from Doran, and they say, will planned siege upgrades be accessible in existing worlds too? And Tarn's response is, the things that require a world gen update, possibly the defenses for that, won't be there. The AI and siege weapon changes will carry over, I think. It's not clear with more granular combat changes. I think the basic changes like adding reach will carry over, but some of the possible specifics there might not, if they are procedural. A question from B Diamond Shaker, and they say, what upcoming stuff do you find most exciting and enjoyable to work on? And Tarn's response is, it varies. I've had fun with my die project, less fun with menus. I think that a lot of the siege stuff will be fun, making maps and plotting through the magical stuff, since the forms of enjoyment vary. I like being surprised by things, and I like it when something comes together nicely after tinkering with lots of components. Another question from Kanapaka, and they say, will the map rewrite bring changes to settlements in adventure mode? Currently, they're quite repetitive and annoying to traverse. With some fortresses being so chaotic, the architecture doesn't even make sense. And Tarn's response is, there isn't a map rewrite anymore, as a large chunk. There are upcoming map things on the development page, and then all of the map stuff comes after that. I think the upcoming map things will apply less to the settlements since they need to be active in fort mode. There will probably be related changes to adventure mode site travel, depending on how the underground maps get glued together. That may, at least, address some of the traversal issues, but it's not clear how that will unfold since it isn't the focus. Question from Sedark, and they mentioned watching my interview with Tarn, and they ask, will we be able to forget the protection of the gods and have new rooms like Arcanum Sanctums to act in a similar way without to what you commented as temples and runes doing? Mainly because it's cool to have temples and cool to have a religion system. However, what if I want to play more Arcanocracy? Arcanocracy? Sure, where instead of relying on gods, they rely on magic. That, I imagine, will come later in the updates. And Tarn's response is, having broad working, interesting, and useful magic systems is one of the main goals of the overall magic work, but it isn't a focus of the siege stuff. For the sieges, we're just trying to provide something, and it'll become more varied later. A question from Mousy Artist, and they say, I noticed only humans can be outsiders, and I was wondering if this is intentional or simply something you didn't get around to yet. I feel like all the animal people who exist in the world would fit the outsider role too. With outsiders specifically, when I played, they only have access to weapons and armor. Is there any plans to add a generic set of gear? Because this feels weird. You can't start with socks and a backpack and a water skin, but you can wield a platinum full plate armor. Which, finally, with Chosen and Heroes, is there any plan of allowing followers of a lower type? Like a chosen hero and his band of heroic but not chosen friends, or a heroic knight and his peasant squire. I assume there is hardware limitations, but curious how likely this is. And Tarn's response is, I've more and more lost the sense of what the outsider is. We used to have some off-map foreign civilizations generated that could make more sense of the materials and clothing, but as everything became more of a simulation, those fell out of favor, and the world has more of its own things. Now the outsider is a weird fighty player lens, which is why it's human. It should probably just be better specified or broken up. And do you mean followers or party members specifically? You can already have a lower tier followers for party members. It's tricky because you can change to other party members and then the whole focus and the type of game changes. So there are various cases and issues to handle. Like if you change off of your chosen character, I think there are already some bugs in this regard. Would you be watching your other party member being told things by the gods and then they are still just sort of following you around? Or asking you nicely to go do the thing, but we are acting on it because they are a party member? We haven't handled it, but ideally, we would. A question comes in from Rum Rusher, and they say, I wonder if ordinary difficulty option for adventure mode will at least go back to version 4705, with being able to pick any site to start from as long as the adventure playable entities owns it. As it is now, set up the filters on sites that limits the modder options on the site types to use for modding, at least for adventure mode. As I tested removing the site from character starting pool, it also removes the creature from play. If you add the removed site back, into the list, the creature could start from any other location. I feel like if the reason for removing the sites were due to some player's inability to escape from the site, then a warning would probably help folks who want to risk the dangers of being lost. As it seems, Ordinary is said to have the most freedom, all features are accessible but has no direction, or something like that. I don't know why campsites, lairs, and caves and a bunch of other starts were removed from the starting pool, as these just plop you directly on the surface. And Tarn's response is, I'm not sure a warning is enough, since it'd be easy to bypass. But while the sites are still junk, perhaps a setting would work, though you can also change it by accident. I think the others were also removed because they are confusing, not as maps, but as empty, somewhat antisocial places. I'll give it more consideration. And now we have a rapid-fire multi-parter from Nope Nope, so we'll get through that. The first one is, right now the dev page is divided into 3 parts. The short-term roadmap, you updated the various 2020 goals, and the long-term stuff, like adventure roles. Does it still roughly match the current plans? And Tarn's response is, the short-term roadmap is the only settled matter timeline-wise. The next short-term roadmap will be built based on our needs at the time, but the 2020 roles, etc. notes will have a great deal to do with populating the new short-term map, but we have to be flexible about the timeline. The next question from Nope Nope is, will player fortresses be involved in the fundamental disruptive events with possible consequences for fortress defense? And Tarn's response is, this is not yet clear, but will be interesting, especially if defenses become more inflected about the particular deity or religion, since this would say a lot about worship in a fortress. A lot of the world gen stuff is related, but would be delightful to get up and running in the fort for societal collapse reasons and others. Another question from Nope, and they say, what kind of weird deep sites did you have in mind? Referring to Blind's interview. And Tarn's response is, stuff related to the underground animal people, stuff related to the new myth stuff related to old myth stuff related to the gobby and knobby stuff that makes for a nice, expansive, varied underground, other stuff. They have to be fun to crack open in fort mode, and they have to be fun to arrive at in adventure mode, if they have more traditional entrances intact, and you should be able to incorporate them into your fortresses, or interact with them if they are friendly somehow. Another one from Nope Nope, and they say, will more advanced diplomacy, possibly moddable or scriptable, be part of the siege improvements? Relatedly, will siege improvements tie in with the former intrigue arc? Seeing how historically a huge part of sieges involved parlaying and ceasefire agreements, but also treachery from inside to open the gates, assassinations of reluctant officials, and so on. And Tarn's response is, we've discussed some examples in the planning, but it's not the emphasis. We need the regular old siege attacks to be better in a basic way first. Another one from Nope Nope, and they say, in your lore, are strange moods divinely inspired and thus subject to alterations in the future myth and magic updates, or inherent property of dwarven genius? And Tarn's response to this final question is, there are 5 kinds, and at least one of them sounds supernatural, the possession. I think they are all subject to alteration, regardless of any divine nature, since there will be all sorts of magical things. And that brings us to the end of this month's Future of the Fortress. It's a bit of a dense one. Once again, I will recommend, if you haven't, check out the interview I did with Tarn. It's on the YouTube channel now in its nice edited format. And also all of the audio is available for free on my blog. I'll leave both of those links in the description of this video, and maybe also in a pinned comment if I remember. Another thing I wanted to mention is for this month, merch on my merch store is currently on sale. If you use the code MARCH, you'll get a 8% discount, and if you're subscribed to my Twitch channel, you'll also get 10% total discount. These are not stackable, but they are both active. I've also adjusted a lot of the prices, so the stickers are cheaper, and so are a lot of the mugs. Thank you very much for helping this channel remain sponsor-free, and I hope to see you in the next one.